There was an artificial intelligence program with a duck logo that gave voice commands to relax and calm down. The duck logo was the logo of a company called Mallard, which operates in various sectors. Not long after, a man named Joe in a suit woke up from his stupor. He was suddenly in a building similar to a prison, but with an open roof. Joe felt dizzy and confused because he had no idea where this place was. Joe tried to find his cell phone to call for help. Unfortunately, Joe's cell phone was not in his coat pocket. So, Joe had to ask for help through the door in the cell to be heard by people around his cell. But Joe didn't get an answer from anyone but the sound of a rolling mill. Joe was even more confused because in that room there was only a large mill. Joe then shouted at the situation he was in. He also asked anyone to explain about the place. But suddenly a mysterious man who was in the room next to Joe told Joe to be quiet. Hearing that, Joe then approached the man. Joe then spoke through a small box like a vent to his neighbor. Joe asked for an explanation of the place, but the man didn't answer him. Instead, he said that tomorrow would be a tiring day for Joe. Hearing that, Joe didn't understand what he meant. The mysterious man in the cell next to Joe unfortunately didn't explain anything. The man argued that he had to continue working on the mill. Joe felt annoyed by all that. He tried to get out of that place that was like a prison. He wanted to climb the wall, but it was futile because the wall was high. Meanwhile, Joe only got tired. Not long after, Joe heard the sound of a guard whistling. Joe then approached the sound that came from the door in the cell. It turned out that the guard gave 1 bread and 1 bottle of water through the door hole. Joe, who knew there was someone then, he asked for his help to free Joe. In addition, Joe explained that he was a manager at Mallard's company. Joe also said he had a pregnant wife, so Joe wanted to get out of that place that looked like a prison. Unfortunately, Joe didn't get what he wanted. Joe only got a punch on Joe's hand, which made him feel pain. When night fell, Joe, who didn't get answers to all his questions, Joe tried to make peace with the situation. He sat on the edge of the mill and was about to eat the food given by the guard. Before he had time to eat, he was startled by a voice that disturbed him. At the same time, a projection of Mallard appeared on one of the walls accompanied by a voice. Mallard welcomed Joe to the company's advanced career training and believed that Joe would get better at work. Joe, who heard that, felt strange. Joe tried to ask about the location of this place, but the projection disappeared without telling Joe any information. Then Joe approached the mysterious person in the room next to Joe. The man said that the place was Mallard's company. Joe was asked to rest because tomorrow would make Joe tired. Joe then asked about the man's name, but the mysterious man just shouted and said if everything in that place needed a name. This made everyone in the place scream because they felt disturbed. Hearing the voices of the people, Joe knew that there were many people there. Then Joe decided to sleep because he didn't know what would happen tomorrow. While Joe was fast asleep at 12 o'clock at night, Joe heard the voice of a guard who was about to eliminate the person in the cell. But the person said that he would do better than before. This made Joe scared and confused why the person needed to be eliminated. Joe heard the man's screams until he made no more sound. The next morning before 6 a.m., Joe asked about last night's incident to the man in the cell next to him. The man said that Joe would get used to hearing screams like last night. Soon the guard came and gave him food and a bottle of mineral water. He also told Joe to throw his trash in the toilet because if the room was seen dirty from CCTV, then Joe would get punished. Joe was forced to do the order to avoid getting punished. He went to the toilet to throw away the trash, but Joe was very disgusted by the toilet. Then he returned to his original place. When Joe was sitting, his attention was drawn to the hair on the ground. Then Joe dug the ground slowly. Soon he was surprised because he saw a skull buried under the ground. Joe then told the man in the next cell about the skull. The man just responded to Joe casually and said that many people committed suicide because they could not bear the demands of the company. The incident made Joe even more incredulous that a big company like Mallard, which was worth trillions and had many products spread throughout the world, would do such a cruel thing. Even so, the man asked if Joe read the employment agreement before he signed it. Joe thought for a moment about the man's words. Then Joe began to accept the situation because maybe in the employment agreement there were points that allowed Mallard to do all this. While Joe was enjoying chatting with the man next to his room, Mallard's projection lit up and explained that Joe had to do his bidding, so that Joe could improve his performance. Mallard also said that Joe had to push the mill from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. The minimum number of rounds that Joe must do was 50 rotations. If Joe pushed the mill less than the minimum quota, then Joe would be eliminated. Furthermore, the worker with the fewest rotations would still be eliminated, even if the worker reached the quota. Hearing this, Joe tried to cuss out whoever was running the program. He asked to leave that place right now. Joe was annoyed and said that he had been working for 10 years. He had also been selected as a model employee, but unfortunately, there was no response from the program. The man in the next room said that the way out was to obey the orders Joe got. Joe then hurriedly took off his suit and started pushing the mill. During the first round, Joe had difficulty due to the uneven surface of the mill. At noon, Joe decided to take a break. He sat down and ate and drank, all being accompanied by advertisements from various products made by Mallard. The ads included alcoholic beverages, cosmetics, housing, and other products. Joe felt annoyed seeing the ads. Then Joe continued his work until 10 p.m. came. That meant the working time was over. The first day, Joe managed to collect 100 rounds of points. At 12 p.m., Joe again heard the screaming voice of someone who was about to be eliminated because he got the least points that day. The next morning, Joe's neighbor asked about how many points Joe had managed to collect. Before Joe answered, the man told Joe to slow down when saying his points. The man said if others heard Joe's point total, they would raise their points so Joe would be eliminated. After talking to the man next to his room, Joe started to push the mill. At that time, Joe remembered the memories with his wife named Kate. In his memory, Joe was in the official residence provided by Mallard. Kate, who was pregnant, was very proud of Joe, who got facilities from his workplace. They then entered the house. A few moments later, Kate felt pain in her stomach. Joe then realized he had to get out of that place immediately. Joe continued his work until he had accumulated 150 points. Just as Joe was about to sleep, Joe heard the guard told Joe to walk up to the door and take off all his clothes. Joe realized that he got 150 rotations. Joe was confused why he was called. Joe tried to refuse to approach the door, but the guard told him to go near the door immediately. Joe was surprised because there was a shower that suddenly turned on and soaked Joe's body. He realized that he was allowed to take a shower. The next day, when Joe took a short break, he asked the man in the room next to him. Joe innocently asked about the purpose of pushing the mill. Joe wondered if this would generate electricity or something. Then the man replied that actually nothing was produced from pushing the mill. Hearing that, Joe was again confused about the purpose of this activity. Not long after Joe continued his work, he asked for another mineral water. But the man beside Joe laughed at that and said that the workers were only given 1 bottle per day. The man suggested that Joe fill his bottle with his urine and put the bottle on the corner pillar. Then the man also suggested that Joe could drink it and hide from the CCTV. Joe firmly rejected the suggestion. He finally continued his work without drinking any more mineral water. While Joe was working, he felt dizzy due to lack of mineral water and the extremely hot weather. At that moment, Joe remembered his pregnant wife. That gave Joe the energy to continue his work. Joe was getting excited to be free soon. Until finally the working hours were over, Joe got 370 points. This made Joe exhausted. He then lay down under the milling handle. Joe saw Alex's name on the mill handle. Joe then asked his friend about who Alex was. It turned out that Alex was the person who was previously in Joe's place. He managed to escape from this place. Hearing that, Joe then asked why he didn't report the incident there. Joe then promised that if he got out of here, then he would tell everyone about the torture that Mallard had done. The next day, Mallard appreciated Joe's performance, which managed to collect 370 rounds. Joe got a metal pen with his name written on it, but Joe felt this award was useless, which made Joe angry. Joe also cursed the company because of this award. Unexpectedly, Joe saw the minimum quota, which was originally 50 rotations per day, increased to 370 points. In addition, there is an X symbol in the middle. Seeing that, Joe then protested to the company, but Joe didn't get anything from his anger. Reluctantly, Joe did the job as usual. He pushed one rotation, but Joe didn't see the points increase. The man in the next room then told Joe that Joe actually got a penalty. Joe had to do 2 rotations to get 1 point. At first, Joe was confused about how he got a penalty, but he didn't worry too much about it. He decided to continue his work because he knew that time was running out. Joe didn't even take a break until working hours were over to get 370 points. But it turned out that Joe only managed to get 262 points. This made Joe get a threat from Mallard. She said that she would bring his wife to the place so that Kate could help Joe reach his quota. Hearing that, Joe immediately begged not to invite his wife here. Joe promised to follow all orders from the company. Shortly after that, there was a heat transmitter above Joe's room as a sanction. The next morning, Joe woke up with a lack of sleep. This was due to the heat in his room. But Joe no longer protested to his company. Joe then began to push the mill. He also covered the handle of the mill with his shirt to prevent it from getting hot. Joe slowly pushed it, but he didn't feel strong. He then hallucinated that there was another him. Joe knew that his spirit was dimmed by himself. But Joe's determination to meet his wife made Joe excited all over again. Until finally, Joe managed to reach 370 points, plus the penalty means 740 rotations. Then Joe fell asleep from exhaustion. Around 2 a.m., Joe woke up and saw that the heat transmitter was no longer above his room. Then Mallard showed Joe about the state of his wife named Kate, who had given birth. This was an appreciation because Joe had done a good job. Seeing that, Joe felt sad mixed with happiness because he couldn't accompany Kate and his child. Then before 6 a.m., Joe asked the man in the next room. Joe asked how Alex could escape from that place. The man then decided to tell Joe that Alex escaped through a wall that was not highlighted by the camera. Hearing that, Joe immediately checked the wall and realized that there was a circle shape there. Joe finally scraped the circle with his pen. The next day, the wall looked hollow even though it was small. After work, Joe scraped the hole again. A few days later, Joe managed to make a hole in the wall the size of his body. After he managed to make a hole like Alex did, one night Joe secretly entered the hole, until he came to a dark room. He walked through the place, but Joe only found the handle of the mill. Joe realized that it was just the room next to Joe's room. Shortly afterward, the guards showed up and beat Joe up. In the morning, Joe woke up in his original place. Joe saw that the hole he had made had been covered by the wall again. Joe was shocked and confused. Joe then heard that his company punished the worker in the room next to Joe for provoking other workers to run away. Joe learned that the man had broken his leg and Mallard raised the minimum quota for all workers to 1,000. This was a punishment for all workers because Joe made a mistake. Knowing that, the other workers were upset and scolded Joe. Even the worker next to Joe cried because he couldn't walk and couldn't earn a single point. Joe was really sorry. He then apologized to the man. The man explained that he was one of the engineers who built Mallard. He said that this building was built with artificial intelligence algorithms, so that there was no human intervention in running the rules. Joe, who knew this, had an idea. Joe wanted the workers not to push the mill at all, so that no one would have the least or most points. Joe thought that this would make no one eliminated. Unexpectedly, everyone agreed to Joe's sensible words. Finally, everyone spent the time just relaxing. Until 5 minutes before the end of working hours, Mallard's projection appeared and warned the workers that those with 0 points would be eliminated. Hearing this, some workers began to push the mill for fear of being betrayed by other workers. This made the workers indecisive. Joe then asked them to stand together, but the man in the next room told Joe to push the mill so that only he was eliminated. Joe thought about it, and suddenly the man in the next room said that he was Alex. Joe, who knew that the mysterious man was Alex, was very surprised. He deliberately told Joe to run away to test whether Joe managed to escape without being caught, but it turned out that Alex realized that Joe was also caught like him. Then Joe said goodbye to Alex, because Alex would be eliminated that night. The next day, Mallard's projection showed Kate's condition and also his child who could walk in order to motivate Joe. However, this didn't motivate Joe, but made him even more angry with everyone. Joe then swore at Mallard and kicked the mill. She tried to warn Joe not to do that. Joe didn't care what he said. So, Mallard decided to eliminate Joe. Then 12 people dressed in white and carrying tablets entered Joe's room. They surrounded Joe with blank stares. Joe then asked about this place, but they did not answer Joe's question. Then the guard came and prepared an injection, while saying that the 12 people were witnesses to the eliminated workers. Then the guard threatened to bring Kate to that place, but Joe became angry and beat the guard's face. Joe then swore at everyone and said he wanted out of this company. Joe suddenly woke up with 3 lights on his head. Joe woke up in another room, which seemed to be Joe's office. Then a worker who was a guard in the milling room approached Joe. He explained about what happened while Joe was confused. He said that Joe spent an hour in the milling room. The man also explained that his wife had not yet given birth. Knowing this, Joe looked relieved because Joe felt like leaving his wife for months. The employee appreciated Joe's actions while in the program, especially the orders that Joe echoed to the other workers, which showed a true leadership value. Because he achieved a good performance, Joe got a promotion. Joe was transferred to a better room. When he arrived at his new room, Joe was greeted by Mallard's artificial intelligence, which was exactly the same as the one in the milling room, which traumatized Joe. Before the employee left Joe in his new room, he asked Joe to sign an employment agreement, which stated that Joe must keep Mallard's company training program a secret to other employees, including his own family. After being alone, Joe called his wife using his sophisticated mobile phone. Then Kate received Joe's call, but Kate felt Joe was very strange because he never called at work. Joe then cried when he found out that Kate and their baby were fine. Joe also recalled the bitter atmosphere in the milling room. This made Joe want to resign from his workplace and destroy the company.